Hello, Kaiju United readers, listeners, viewers. I am Jacob Lingle, the main fella at Kaiju United. Today, I will be joined by Patrick Galvan, who is the co founder of Kaiju Masterclass, a brilliant writer in Japanese and Chinese cinema, really knows his stuff. Patrick, once you're in here, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, Jacob. Thank you for the nice introduction and thank you for having me. I'm Patrick Galvan. I am a film journalist. I've been published in such outlets as Sci-Fi Wire, Toho Kingdom, Our Culture Magazine, Offscreen.com, John Lee May's The Lost Films fanzine. And I am one of the co-founders of the online film convention turned YouTube channel, Kaiju Masterclass, which has interviewed a large number of people involved in the Japanese film industry, special effects film industry, such as Shusuke Kaneko, Shinji Higuchi. And also in 2021, we had an interview with the director we're going to be talking about today, Kazuki Omori. We interviewed him in 2021, and he passed away the following year, I believe in October, if I remember correctly. And as far as we know, that was his final interview, and it was a delight to speak to him and hear him talk about his contributions to Japanese cinema and the kaiju films that he worked on. And it's an honor to talk about him today.
I'm sure it was also an honor, even just talking to him about cinema, because when I was watching that episode or panel, we should call it, of Kaiju Masterclass, he kind of started out saying that he was a lover of cinema. So it's nice that he can be remembered by fellow lovers of cinema as well.
Yes, actually, a point that I hope will be illustrated in the course of this discussion is that Omori was very much an outlier as far as the so-called Heisei Godzilla director's cycle, and that he was really the only director of that cycle of films who was really a bona fide, full-fledged director in his own right. His contemporaries like Hashimoto Koji, Okawara Takao, and Yamashita Kensho, these are guys who made 1 to 2 films before their time with Godzilla, and then in all 3 of their cases, literally made nothing once their time with the monster was done. Whereas Omori had already established himself as a filmmaker long before he directed Godzilla vs. Biollante, and remained productive directing films long after he was done writing and directing Godzilla films in the 90s. So he was a true bona fide director who was active throughout his entire very long productive career, which makes him a very interesting figure compared to his contemporaries of the so-called Heisei cycle of Godzilla movies.
Absolutely. So let's get into a little bit about his early life. We'll go to this next slide here.
Yeah, so Omori was born in Osaka in March 1952, and that's actually part of the reason why Osaka is featured so prominently in Godzilla vs. Biollante. That's his hometown. He was the son of a doctor, and he was kind of expected by his family to do the quote-unquote family thing of following in their footsteps and becoming a doctor himself. However, when he was quite young, he developed a boyhood affinity for movies that ultimately stayed with him his entire life. When he was quite young, like around his toddler years, he was taken to see Honda Ishiro's original 1954 Godzilla, and was terrified by it. And when he was a little bit older, about say 10 or so, his father took him to see Daryl F. Zanuck's large, bombastic World War II epic, The Longest Day, which is the film that he credited him for turning him into a quote unquote movie freak. And ever since then, he was a huge fan. He grew up watching some of the early Godzilla films, along with their special effects films from Toho, Atragon, and so forth. He was also a big fan of the French New Wave. And from that, even though he was kind of expected to become a doctor like his father, he from a young age, he's like, I'd kind of like to make movies instead. And so he kind of just held on to that idea of directing film someday. And so kind of an interesting background as far as a person. Well, interesting in the time in which he grew up in, because we're now at a point in history where the Japanese film industry is a very minor shell of its former self than what it had been in, say, the days where Honda and Fukuda were active, for example, working at Toho. In those days, Toho had other studios like Shochiku had a very extensive in-house training where they got underneath the tutelage of experienced professionals, and through their mentors they would learn through hands-on experience the entire process of making movies, everything from developing scripts to directing to working with the art staff, sometimes even standing in for actors, and just getting a full hands-on training experience of what it takes to actually make a high-quality film. That's the sort of system that nurtured the talents of people like Fukuda and Honda, and also people like the legendary Kurosawa Akira, for example. However, in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, the industry has changed dramatically. Television has come along and is cannibalizing audiences from the film industry in Japan. And so the studios, they're noticing, the attendance is dropping, profits are going down, and inevitably things start to change and things start to downsize. And those kind of intensive training programs that had nurtured people like Kurosawa and Honda and Fukuda and various others are starting to go away, unfortunately. And so and so by the time Omori is coming along, in the 60s and the 70s, well, that kind of experience that Honda had the benefit of, it's either completely gone or it's very quickly on its way out, and so for someone like him to get his foot in the filmmaking door, it was a little more difficult than, say, what it had been for the previous generation.
As a side note, can I ask you, because you know a lot about the Chinese film industry as well, what do you personally think created this model of like apprenticeship versus like the old Hollywood style of filmmaking, which I'm a little more familiar with?
Well, it's worth noting that the studios each operated in their own separate individual ways. Toho was a very producer-oriented system. Even though the directors were being nurtured and talented, there was still a producer who would supervise everything from start to finish. Tanaka Tomiyuki, of course, very famously was a byproduct of that situation. And it's probably not for that reason, it's probably not a coincidence that, generally speaking, the best Godzilla films were the ones that were made underneath his watch. At Shochiku, directors were generally given a little more weave and control of their films. I'm not really sure, where the impetus for that kind of system came from, but that's just what the Japanese film industry did in its early golden years, and that's what nurtured so many impressive directors who left a huge mark on their industry. And unfortunately, once that kind of system went away, well, it was more difficult for people to get that kind of experience and get the kind of training they needed. So
Interesting.
There's a lot of the course of Japanese film history is very complicated, and there's probably a lot of reasons why, generally speaking, the best films were made, as it happens, in the time period in which the Godzilla films first came along. So
that makes sense to me. So he did shoot 8mm and 16mm indie films. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So at this point in history, there's not many university courses about filmmaking. There's not as many apprenticeship programs to get into in the film studios. So basically, if you wanted to figure out how to make movies, well, you had to do it by yourself. And luckily for people like Omori, this is the time. And quick little side tangent. I was in Japan last month, and while I was there, I saw a film from Kanaka Kozuya called Single 8, which is about high school students in the 1970s who see Star Wars and are inspired to make their own sci-fi film. And they do so by renting equipment from the local camera shop and shooting it on Super 8, or as the Japanese called it, Single 8 film. And that's basically, what people like Omori had to do. They would rent equipment from the camera shops or nearby school if they happened to be near one, and just figured it out by themselves, just shooting movies on their own. So that's what he did, starting when he was in high school. But as I mentioned before, there was no real promise that if you wanted to become a filmmaker that you could actually make it. Actually, Omori said, here's a direct quote from him. At that time, there was no set way to become a director in Japan or special courses for it at universities. So I decided to study medicine first and figured that I could perhaps become a doctor later. So out of practicality reasons and kind of perhaps also from impetus from his family, he decided to follow his father's footsteps and go to medical school, which he did. He went to medical school in Kyoto. However, while he was there, he had not quite given up his love for making movies. And while he was in medical school, he was actually making films on his own. He made a film in 1975 called Can't Wait Until Dark, which actually featured an acting appearance by the great director Suzuki Seijun, if you're familiar with him. If you're not familiar with him, look him up and check out his movies. But anyway, so he kind of got his foot in the door, very impressively with stuff like that. And then in 1977, he wrote a screenplay for a contest called the Kido Awards. The Kido Awards is a contest that's, it might still be, I'm not sure, sponsored by Shochiku, named after their famous producer Kido Shiro, in which they would accept screenplay submissions, and the winners would sometimes get the offers to be produced into feature-length films. And so Omori submitted a screenplay called Orange Road Express. It won a prize at the Kido Awards, and Shochiku returned it to him with an offer to direct it, which he did the following year, 1978. And so during this time period, as you can see, during this time period, while he was, studying to become a doctor, he was a little more active, on the film front, trying to get his foot in the door, get some film accomplishments going. And as he told Steve Reifel and I when we interviewed him for Kaiju Masterclass 2 years ago, typically Japanese medical school requires 6 years of study. But Omori spent so much time focused on this little side hustle of his and his passion that he spent an additional 2 years in medical school before he could graduate. So, which probably indicates where his heart really was at that time period.
So all those camera rental fees, they're going to catch up to you. So I was reading a little bit about Omori leading up to this. I'm going to butcher this title because I'm going to butcher it, I guess. Disciples of Hippocrates, I believe it's called. You can correct me on that. It wasn't this like the first, I would say, major work of his, like they got a little bit more recognized than just the Kyoto Awards? Yes.
Yep. So Disciples of Hippocrates was his first movie he made after he graduated medical school. He graduated in 1980, the same year the film came out. And probably smartly, he decided to make a film based on something that he actually knew, which was the trials and tribulations of medical school, which is what this film is about. By the way, the gentleman on the left side of the screen, that's Imoto Akira, whom Godzilla fans know for playing Yuki in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. He was also one of the politicians in Shin Godzilla. Very dark, twisted, very cynical and kind of wry, dark comedy about the rigors of medical school. At times, a very depressing film. But yeah, when this film came out, it was showered with acclaim from the press. And Omori credited this film with helping him get his foot in the door as a director. He said, here's another quote from him, "You could say, I only studied medicine to make this film. Through Disciples of Hippocrates, I was confirmed in my achievement as a director. It opened up other avenues for my career. I don't see my medical studies as a detour, but as a path to becoming a director. And from then on, I worked exclusively as a film director." So even though he had graduated from medical school, he did not immediately pursue a medical license because he obviously his passion and his interest was in filmmaking instead.
Was this more so when he could do this more full time in film, or did he just choose to put his eggs in the film basket per se?
Probably more putting his eggs in the film basket per se, and as we'll see in the next slide, it was kind of a big gamble for him. So this is the film that he made the following year called Hear the Wind Sing. This is an adaptation of Murakami Haruki's novel of the same title, which was published in Japan 2 years earlier, 1979. As it happens, Omori and Murakami were actually fellow alumni from the same junior high school. Omori had joined the school the same year that Murakami was graduating, and actually Omori's homeroom teacher had been Murakami's literature teacher at the school. And the novel came out, and the novel was savaged by critics, but Omori saw a lot of interesting qualities in it, and it became intrigued about it and wanted to try making it into a feature-length film. And so sometime in the early 80s, probably, it might have been the same year, I'm not sure, but he tracked Murakami down at a cafe he was known to frequent in Tokyo, and used the fact that they were fellow alumni from the same school and had a teacher in common to win his favor and get approval to get the rights to adapt the novel into a film. And Murakami basically said, great, go for it. And that's how this project got off the ground. Hear the Wind Sing, in my opinion, it's probably my favorite Omori film that doesn't have a monster in it. Probably because it's a very interesting take on a film. And actually making this film presented Omori with some challenges he did not expect. The novel has a very disjointed structure, and as many Japanese critics pointed out when the novel first came out, the characters don't really talk like ordinary Japanese. They kind of speak in a very unusual, artificial style kind of language, a very different kind of vernacular. It's not ordinary, everyday Japanese. And that presented Omori with the challenge. Okay, how do I what works well on a page? How do I translate that cinematically? And as he thought about it, he thought about how the dialogue was written and how it came across in the novel. And he thought to himself, well, this dialogue kind of resembles when foreign films would get subtitled into Japanese. It kind of reads sort of like the subtitles in subtitled foreign films. It sounds kind of like a foreign kind of language, so to speak, or a foreign translation of it. And so he thought to himself, okay, well, there's your answer. Direct the film in a way that is, quote unquote, foreign. And so, as I mentioned before, he was a fan of the French New Wave, and as such, he was familiar with the great French director Jean-Luc Godard. And so his solution to this predicament that he found with adapting the novel was to shoot it in a Godard-style manner, which is what he chose to do. And which, again, I think is a big reason why this film really stands out from his other works for me, and why I consider it one of his more interesting pictures that doesn't have Godzilla in it. However, that said, the film actually threatened to derail Omori's career basically when it just seemed to have been getting started, because the film was a colossal flop. It cost 25 million yen to produce, made back a small fraction of it, and Omori did not get another directing job for, I think, 2 or 3 years after this. And actually, his friends used to tease him that it was because this film flopped so badly that Murakami, for years afterwards, would refuse permission for other filmmakers to adapt his works into films. Now, of course, Murakami has since come around on that. There's been films like Tony Takatani, Norwegian Wood, and most famously Drive My Car, directed by Hamaguchi Ryusuke a couple years ago, which are based on his work. So he didn't stick to that conviction for very long. But Omori actually had a wish to return to Murakami's world, so to speak. In 1985, he wanted to adapt his novel A Wild Sheep Chase into a film. But this time Murakami turned him down, and the excuse he gave him was, I didn't like how when Hear the Wind Sing played on television, they would interrupt the story with commercials. Now, that to me sounds like a very polite, roundabout Japanese way of saying, I don't want you to do it. So, but that's the reason he gave him, and for that reason, Omori never had a chance to work on a Murakami adaptation again. So this was his one and only adaptation of Murakami's work. However, in spite of its bad reputation, and in spite of, at the time, and in spite of the threats that it brought to his professional career at the moment, he would show this film to his, we'll get to it later, but Omori in his later years was active as a film professor in Osaka, and he would show this movie amongst other films of his to his students. And he was delighted to know that of all his films that he showed, his students usually liked this one the best. So it's one of those proverbial films that was ignored or dismissed at the time, but has since come around to, at least in its home country among some people, getting some proper recognition. And again, for me at least, it's probably my favorite film of his that doesn't have a monster in it.
Is there a way to see this officially, or is it just unofficial methods?
Unofficial methods, unless you want to just purchase the DVD from Japan and trust your Japanese enough to follow the story.
Gotcha. All right, we're on the road to Godzilla, huh?
Yes. So in 1983, Omori did decide to apply for a medical license, and he did get it. So he was actually a licensed doctor. However, he was not by any means done with pursuing film, even though his directing career was pretty heavily stalled at this point. In 1982, he was one of the co-founding members of a short-lived production outlet called The Directors Company. His co-founders included Kurosawa Kiyoshi, to name one. And they produced a large number of Pink films. They also produced a really excellent horror film called Evil Dead Trap that was released in 1988, I believe. And then finally, in 1984, he finally had a chance to, I should say this real quickly, he was, during this time period, he did get some gigs directing television and whatnot. And then finally, in 1984, with this film, Pauper's Walk, he finally got another feature directing gig and was starting to build his reputation back up again. And he was employed at Watanabe Productions in 1986, which is when Tanaka Tomoyuki of Toho finally got wind of him and started to set into motion the idea of having him direct a Godzilla film.
I didn't know he was scouted in 1986. That makes sense for the development history of Biollante, but I just found that particularly interesting that it was that early on. Mm-hmm. Have you seen Pauper's Walk, by the way?
I have not seen this one, no.
Okay. There's a quote by him.
Yep. So I think this is probably reasonably well known. But Omori, by the time that Toho is starting to peg him as a Godzilla director, and as he openly admitted to Tanaka and to the producers in the front office, he had basically outgrown Godzilla. When he was a young man, he'd seen the first film, was terrified by it, was a fan of the films growing up as a young kid. But around the time that he got into, say, middle school or junior high school, he kind of came to view kaiju movies as basically just, as he described, akin to professional wrestling. It was, to him, it was, kind of silly, kind of campy. He had nostalgia for it, and kind of a fond boyhood memory of it. And he didn't dislike Godzilla by any means, but he just wasn't a fan of it anymore. He'd outgrown it. And at this point in time, he's a much bigger fan of films from Hollywood. He's a big fan of early Spielberg films, George Lucas. As time went on, he was a big fan of John Sturges, John Frankenheimer, who he counted as his favorite director. And as time would go on, he'd become a big fan of films by people like James Cameron, and big fan of films like John Carpenter's The Thing, the remake of The Blob. So, and of course, he was a fan of films from France as well. But he was a big Hollywood guy. And he just didn't really have a whole lot of interest in Godzilla anymore. And he openly told Toho this, I don't dislike Godzilla, but, Godzilla is just not something that I find all that interesting anymore. And Tanaka basically said to him, well, if you were to do a Godzilla film, how would you go about doing it? Which, again, to me, comes across as a very polite, roundabout Japanese way of saying, well, please make this film. So
we would like you to make this movie.
But as it turns out, that actually kind of worked out, because one of Tanaka's big ideas for the next Godzilla film was to make it in a style of Hollywood entertainment. We should mention, going back to the 84 film, which this film follows. So the 84 film came out in December of 84, and it was reasonably successful, all things considered. The film had grossed, in terms of its revenue, in terms of ticket sales, it had grossed 1.7 billion yen. However, it fell a little short of what Toho had hoped for. Their revenue goal for the film in terms of box office was 2 billion yen. So 1.7 billion yen, respectable, but it was a little short of what they'd hoped for. And they hoped that Godzilla would do a little better than that. And so their idea was to then look at the audience research for the 84 film, see who had gone to see the film, and kind of analyze that and figure out, what were they missing out on that could probably excite audiences today in the 80s. And they found that a large portion of their audience for the 84 film had been college students and elementary age kids. So these are people who grew up on the likes of films like Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and were much more accustomed to fast-paced, kinetic, lavish, Hollywood-style entertainment, not unlike Omori. And so, so part of Tanaka's idea for the next Godzilla film, in addition to making a Hollywood-style film, the idea was to bring in somebody who was much younger. And so Omori was born in 52, so he is the first Godzilla director to be born after the events of World War II. So this is a director who has factually no memories of the events that spawned Godzilla in the first place. And and he just kind of he's part of this new generation that's much more interested in what the West is making in terms of cinema. So that's one of the reasons why he was scouted out to do this film. However, the making of so Toho had hoped originally, and I don't know if Omori had already been brought on board at this point, but their initial plan was to have a film out by December of '86. Well, obviously that did not happen. The film was delayed quite extensively over the next couple of years. And if we can go to the next slide. So the film was delayed, eventually comes out in 1989, as we all know. And during the interim, Toho tasked Omori with making films of a completely different variety. There was a film in 1986, again, the year that the Godzilla sequel was supposed to come out originally, a film called Women in Love. It's a teen idol film. That film had some production issues, and they needed to have a new director step in to handle it. So they thought, well, hey, Omori's this hot shot, bright new talent. This Godzilla film's not going anywhere. Why don't we have him work on this instead? Also like a teen idol film. For those who don't know, teen idol films, they're films that star popular singers who have a dedicated, established fan base. These are films that don't require special effects. They're a lot less expensive than a monster film. And so they have a much more greater chance of making a big splash at the box office. And if they don't, well, they weren't that expensive to begin with. So it's not a huge loss, either way. And so they had Omori step in, make this film called Young Women in Love. And the film came out. It was quite successful. It was a huge hit. And so over the course of the next 80s, as Godzilla kept being drawn out year after year, they had Omori instead focus attention on making other films in the teen idol genre, to the point where that was basically what he was associated with. That's kind of like, people in the film criticism spectrum kind of thought of Omori as this this teen idol director. Why are they paying him to make a Godzilla film? But so he made a large number of these films throughout the back half of the 80s. 3 of them starred the idol Yuki Saito, who makes a musical cameo of sorts in Godzilla vs. Biollante. We recall the scene when Godzilla is marching on Osaka, and there's the concert playing that song that the news interrupts. Well, that was a Yuki Saito song that was playing in that concert that he interrupts in the film. So yeah, Omori was on a professional level closely associated with Saito. And actually there was a joke at the time that, people were kind of disappointed that, when Biollante comes out, well, hey, why isn't Yuki Saito in the credits somewhere? Why isn't she like the star or whatever? And actually, another funny anecdote, in 1980, I want to say 87, I could be wrong. He made a film called Toto Channel, which starred Yuki Saito. And there is a scene in which she's driving up to the Toho lot, and she passes by this truck, and they're loading a Godzilla suit off the truck. And on the soundtrack, there is the classic Akira Ifukube Godzilla theme, dun, 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 playing on the soundtrack. So,
what film was that?
It's called Toto Channel. It's like the vast majority of everything Omori's directed, it's not readily available in the United States. But for that reason as well, perhaps people are kind of expecting her to have more than just a musical cameo in Biollante when it came out. But yeah, that's basically what he was doing in the interim while Godzilla was being drawn out year after year. And he was also getting all kinds of awards for these films. He won the Art Council's New Director Award for Toto Channel. He directed a film honoring the centennial of the city Kobe in 1989. And so he was building a pretty good reputation for himself. But and so the plan was, okay, eventually he's going to make a Godzilla film, but it's not here yet. And then finally it comes around in 1989, as we know. And so the curious thing about Biollante is this film was greenlit kind of suddenly, kind of out of nowhere, after years and years of being drawn out. Normally, a Godzilla film is greenlit in January or February of the year it's supposed to come out, or if not that, maybe the December of the previous year. Biollante finally got the green light in May 1989, and the film had to be finished in November '89 to be out in time for its December release. So to say that it was a rush job is putting it quite lightly, and that's it's really impressive. The film came out as well as it did, all things considered.
That's like some Megalon levels of turnaround. I actually didn't know that. That's really crazy.
Yep. We should also mention the famous Godzilla story contest that helped pave the way for this thing. So before Omori was brought on board, they had their story before Omori started working on the script and whatnot. They had their story contest. Had over 5,000 entries that were submitted. The judges, which included Osamu Tezuka, the famous manga artist, and who also, like Omori, had a background in medicine. They picked 10 stories that they thought were pretty good, and they picked 5 stories that they thought were exceptional. And they showed Omori the 5 top stories. And in combining what he saw, what he liked from various stories, and adding his own ideas, that's where he started to forge what became the screenplay for Godzilla versus Biollante. Kobayashi Shinichiro's famous script produced things like the bioengineering stuff and whatnot. Kobayashi also had the idea of what became Miki Sayagusa in his story pitch. And Omori used a lot of his ideas. He used ideas from other screenplays, brought his own ideas. He created the characters of Gondo and Kuroki. And from there started to develop the script for Godzilla versus Biollante. And and the thing is, the movie, the screenplay for the film begins with the following. I think I have it written down here. Oh yeah, the script for the film begins with a description called "This is a scientific film, an adventure film, a war film, a human drama, and a Godzilla film." And Omori openly admitted that he wasn't all that interested in the whole Godzilla fighting Biollante side of the story. He was much more fascinated in mankind versus Godzilla, and that's what he described his. He said, if I have a theme for this movie, it is strong Godzilla, Godzilla versus mankind. And that's probably a reason why the film emphasizes so much the self-defense forces and their attempts to stop Godzilla. It's more of a Godzilla versus humankind kind of story than a monster versus Godzilla story. So again, and maybe pointing back to what he thought was his keen interest, which was not so much the monster, but like the drama produced by a monster appearing in the world. And he thought, well, hey, when Godzilla appeared in the 50s, Japan was much smaller, in many ways than it is now. Now Japan is much bigger and much more elaborate. So in order for Godzilla to be impressive and intimidating, he's got to be much more powerful. And so that's why why he emphasized the whole mankind versus Godzilla thing, and having Godzilla be this extraordinary, unstoppable force that they just can't seem to get rid of. And of course they introduced a lot of fresh ideas, like the whole bioengineering thing, trying to stop Godzilla with biological means, which they had touched upon in the '84 film and really emphasized in this film here. So and we should also mention that Godzilla versus Biollante is literally and figuratively, despite the chronology that fans associate it with, literally and figuratively, it's the first true Heisei film in the series, because it's made when after Hirohito has passed away, so the Showa era has since passed on. Akihito, the Heisei emperor, is now the emperor of Japan. So it's the first true Heisei film, even though the '84 film is maybe its predecessor in its timeline. This is the first true Heisei film, and therefore I think it's kind of appropriate that we have a true post-war director in the form of Omori working on this. We have Kawakita bringing a fresh new style of special effects to the game. So even though it's a direct sequel to '84, it's very much unlike its predecessor and very much unlike the films that came before it in the Showa series. So it kind of started the Heisei series off in a very stylish way. That's what I think is probably this film's biggest legacy as far as the timeline of the Godzilla films go. In addition to continuing this chronology of timeline movies in the '90s and whatnot, it's the first true entry in the Heisei series.
Yeah, it's like you said, literally and kind of figuratively, the next generation making their entryway in the Godzilla. And when I think of this movie, now that you've pointed out his love for directors like James Cameron, I mean, the opening scene with the Seradian agent, that's right out of something James Cameron would do with his action films, the way it's shot,
Mhm.
the intensity. People are getting shot and killed like way more than like earlier Godzilla films.
Mhm.
It's definitely the most influential in terms of Hollywood, aside from probably the next film we're going to talk about with like Terminator and stuff.
Yeah. We should also mention Omori was a big 007 fan, big James Bond guy, so that also plays a factor, I'm sure, into.
Me too. He has some good taste. Here's another quote.
Yeah, so guys, we'll get into Godzilla versus King Ghidorah and how this film kind of came along. So Godzilla versus Biollante comes out in December of '89 with very little marketing, and consequently did not do so hot at the box office. It actually made even less than its '84 predecessor did. Now, there's been conflicting accounts as to whether or not how much of a disappointment it was. Like a Fortune magazine at the time claimed that Toho took a loss of $3 million on the thing. Omori and others involved in the production said that it wasn't that bad. It was more like, yeah, it did okay. It didn't bomb, but still, whatever the case, same result. The film had done not as well as they had hoped it would do. Even less than its predecessor had. And so the mentality was like, okay, well, what comes next? And so after Biollante, there was some projects that were to involve Mothra. There was the Mothra versus Bagan script project that Tanaka had spurred and passed along to Omori. That project eventually evolved into a pitched remake of Mothra versus Godzilla. Get Godzilla back into the story, so to speak. There were ideas of a King Kong versus Godzilla, rematch coming along somewhere in the pipelines, but all those things obviously never came to fruition. And eventually we got Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. Well, hey, bring back Godzilla's, most popular nemesis. And maybe that will help propel the box office a little bit. Now, Godzilla versus King Ghidorah is very famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, for its, for many reasons, but partly for its whole time travel plot line and all the various plot holes and things that are involved in that whole time travel scenario. Now, at the time Biollante had come out in '89, there was another film playing in Japanese cinemas, a foreign film that was dominating the box office. That was called Back to the Future Part 2. And so, so Omori used this as an argument for Tanaka, like, oh, hey, let's make it more fantasy-like, and let's do time travel. Obviously the audience is interested in that kind of thing. It's worth noting that, between Biollante and King Ghidorah, Omori had directed another film about time travel. He'd made a comedy called Mangetsu, Mr. Moonlight, which is about a samurai who is time slipped or transported into the modern day. If you've seen the Sonny Chiba film G.I. Samurai, kind of imagine that, but the reverse and with more comedy. And he was a fan also, I should say, of George Powell's The Time Machine from the '60s. So time travel was of interest to him. And he used Back to the Future Part 2's box office dominance over Biollante to help sell, including time travel, in this film. Now, the other reason why this film is so contentious and infamous is because of, actually go back to the previous slide really quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, is that it tackles the whole bubble economy thing that was happening in Japan at the time. And now if we can flash forward to the next slide. For those of you who don't know, in the 1980s, because and I'm sure that's a lot of people because it was it predates you and me, and it's long forgotten unless you lived through it or if you're really familiar with history. In the 1980s, Japan experienced what's called a bubble economy, which is basically through increased trade influx, new financial programs, and reforms by the government and whatnot, Japan became, as a nation and through individuals, substantially much wealthier, to the point where it was getting a lot of massive international interest. More so when Japanese companies and corporations started to acquire properties from around the world. It especially took off in 1988 when the Japanese acquired $16.5 billion worth of property just in the United States. Just in the United States. They were also issuing 10% of bank loans in London. They were acquiring the floating hotels in Vietnam. They acquired, as we can see here, skyscrapers. They acquired Columbia Pictures, CBS Records. They, for a while, had control of the Rockefeller Center. They bought up a lot of golf courses in the United States. They were so there was a lot of income that was happening around the world that was pushing into Japanese pockets. And so Japan, which had been this at one time been this financially crippled war-torn nation, was all of a sudden bouncing back and kind of threatening to upseat the United States and the Western world as like this major economic presence. And this was quite contentious in the 80s. Keep in mind we're also at a point where memories of World War II, people who lived through that, still a thing. So there was some racial animosity going on at the same time as well. But anyhow, so bubble economy is really surging in the late 1980s, and it was well known by all around the world. And Japan was oftentimes being mocked, made fun of, questioned, whatever in the press and by political commentators for achieving such things. It got to the point where USA Today ran a front page article saying, quote, "Will Japan end up buying it all?" Now, of course, the bubble economy is a long forgotten thing, so it's not a major talking point anymore. But in its time, it was quite well known, and so Omori reflected this in Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. The whole idea of Japan's bubble economy going on forever and forever and forever to the point where it's acquiring not only properties, but entire countries, essentially controlling the entire world. And then you have the what's often criticized about the film, the whole notion of time travelers from the West coming back to destroy Japan and subjugate them to prevent this kind of major economic hubris. So, and the thing about this whole thing is that what makes Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah really stand out amongst other Japanese films of its time period is that it's probably the film that most crassly addressed the bubble economy head on. You had films like Itami Juzo's Taxing Woman series duology, which made fun of excessive wealth in Japan, but not a whole lot of Japanese films, at least to my knowledge, really tackled the subject head on, at least of all in a very brazen way like this film does. Imagining a future in which the bubble economy goes on forever and Japan controls the entire world. So that combined with the film's very contentious and controversial World War II sequences, it's as I mentioned, there were memories of World War II very prominently at this time. So for that reason, even though the film never came stateside, it made news. It made news in America where audiences couldn't even see the film, but it caught notice internationally for its subject matter.
That's I just find that especially interesting historically as well. I mean, there's very few times I've heard of Godzilla making the news besides like when 84 came out, when the Raymond Burr cut was playing in American cinemas. To make American news because of your movie that is purely Japanese is not seeing a release here because of the way it interprets we'll call it a little bit of political, I don't want to say divisiveness, but, just kind of controversy. We'll say that. It's just a big feat. I mean, the only other time I would remember is later on when we talk about Destroya, when they were reporting the fact that Godzilla was dying in the film.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a screenshot from the World War II sequence. A lot of people will remember, take that, you dinosaur, from the English dub.
Yeah, man. From the Japanese version, that's what they say in the Japanese version as well. So the World War II sequence. Now, when we interviewed Omori for Kaiju Masterclass, he talked about this, and he said that his real motivation with this whole thing, as I mentioned before, he was one of the film that he cited as turning him into a big movie freak was Darryl F. Zanuck's World War II film, The Longest Day. And we should mention that, it was with Godzilla that Omori finally had the chance, the budget and the wherewithal and the production schedules to make big, lavish films in the style of Hollywood. He didn't have that before when he was working with, smaller scale films. So he said, like, hey, this is a chance for me to, like, make a sort of my own The Longest Day, granted on a much smaller scale, one scene, but that's what he cited as, like, his reason for doing this. Now, there were also statements he gave at the time that were kind of the effect of, like, well, hey, in so many World War II movies, the Americans always win, so maybe they should lose for a change or something. So a little bit of contradiction between statements and anecdotes on his part, but yeah, this sequence in particular, probably more than the bubble economy stuff, was what really got under the skin of a lot of people, and what was really shown in, like, the news programs, and got people who were involved in, like, associated with the Pearl Harbor remembrances to comment on it. Yeah, I'd say this scene, probably more than anything else in the film, was what really got it the international attention that it ended up receiving. When we talked to Mr. Omori for Kaiju Masterclass, and we talked about the whole bubble economy thing, and we informed him, like, hey, when the film came out, your film was accused of being anti-American. The Wall Street Journal even ran a front page news story about this film, accusing it of playing up to Japan's obsession with World War II and the bubble economy stuff and whatnot. So we brought that up to him, and he was quite amused by it. He laughed at it, and then he told us what he said was his real motivation behind this whole bubble economy scenario with the film. He said that his intentions with the film were actually to present the Futurians as, in a sense, heroes. And he was arguing that, in his mind, future Japan was the real villain of the story for buying up and controlling the entire planet. And so the Futurians were, in a sense, doing something noble by trying to stop them. That's what he told us his intentions were. Now, that kind of contradicts what he said in that previous that I mentioned earlier, where he's like, yeah, Japan's being bashed by the Western world. Let's show that in the movie. But that's what he argued. And to an extent, I can kind of see what he's talking about, namely with the character of Mr. Shindo. So here's a guy who survives World War II and who in the film is credited for rebuilding Japan to become a major economic force, and who uses his rash wealth. He purchases an atomic submarine with atomic capacity, docks it outside of the country to avoid the conflict with the non-nuclear principles that Japan has, and then sends it to revive Godzilla, not knowing Godzilla has already been revived, and then Godzilla becomes more powerful and proceeds to wipe out Japan. So, and then there's that, of course, that very famous moving scene where they confront each other, and Shindo accepts his fate at the hands of the monster that he thought was his savior. So, through this character, I can kind of see a little bit of what he's talking about. Now, at the same time, I don't blame people for questioning his explanation of this film's theme, because the Western time travelers, they're not very subtle in their portrayal whatsoever. They're basically mustache twirling, cigar smoking types, and and above all, well, not above all, in addition to many things, this film's screenplay needed a couple of Honda Ishiro style speeches proclaiming what the film's about to make it a lot more clear to the audience what the film is trying to say. But through a little bit of what through a little bit of this sequence, I can understand a little bit of what he's talking about. And he said part of his reason for wanting to have this sequence as well, this kind of points up to Omori's imagination as a director, is that he wanted to have scenes in which the monster stuff and the human drama interacted. He didn't just want people in a control room looking at a monitor saying Godzilla is going through Tokyo. He wanted some interaction between the special effects and the live action drama. And so that's where this whole sequence sort of came about. So what was I going to say here? Okay. Pardon looking at my notes.
All good.
Yeah, you'll have to edit this out when we broadcast this.
No, it's all good. Yeah, that's why we're pre-recording.
Yeah, that's always the way to do it. Oh yeah. So now, in spite of everything I've just said about the bubble economy, here's what makes Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah very, very interesting. This movie comes along at a point in history where the bubble economy is basically on its last legs. So in December of 1990, or sometime in late 1990, it could have been in October, sometime in the later months of the year, the Japanese stock market had a major crash, resulting in a loss of over 500 trillion yen. And by the time this film comes along, more than 30 Japanese banks are in danger of failing. And for some context, at this time, a Japanese bank had not failed since the 40s. So Japan had lived through a lot of tough economic times, and a bank had not failed in that time, partially because the Japanese banks, in contrast to, say, the Western dog eat dog, you're on your own, buddy kind of way, Japanese banks, when one was in danger of failing, another bank would step in and save them. Well, at this point, there are so many banks that are in trouble that they can't afford to do that. And we have 30 banks that are in danger of failing all of a sudden. And at this point in time, we have a lot of those big investors who are scrambling to sell their overseas investments, not acquire more of them. So this film comes along at a very, very strange point in history, because it almost feels like a wishful fantasy, imagining this period in which the bubble economy goes on forever, when in real life the writing was on the wall. Now, granted, the really nasty effects of the bubble crash and the subsequent lost decade, that would not be felt for a couple of years afterwards. But in spite of that, there were a lot of Japanese who still kind of thought the bubble economy would go on, that the economy would just keep going, never fail them. There's an economist named Christopher Wood wrote a very useful book about the Japanese bubble years, and he wrote from the perspective of 1993 that in spite of the bubble having popped, in spite of the lost decade kind of coming into effect, a lot of Japanese still kind of clung to the belief that the bubble years, the period of great excessive wealth, did not represent their true economy. They thought of it as like a side effect of their core industrial economy. So imagine their core economy is like a tree trunk, and the bubble years was like a branch that came out of that tree trunk. So if the bubble pops, if that branch gets cut off, well, the core economy will keep going on forever. That's kind of how they thought of it at the time. That's not how it was at all. That's just kind of like that's just kind of what a lot of Japanese kind of a belief they clung on to at the time. So for all I know, Omori was one of those people who kind of felt that way himself. But regardless, so it just makes the film that more interesting to kind of consider in hindsight, because it comes along at a point in history where this period of vast rash wealth is on its last legs. It's on its way out. In a few years, it's basically gone. So it's an oddity. So Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is an oddity for many reasons, and for that reason in particular. But for all those reasons, it's a very fascinating oddity, not only in the Godzilla franchise, but also just in terms of Japanese films that came out in that time period in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, like I didn't even know about that book on the economy. I will have to read that because that sounds fascinating. But it's just more of I mean, all Godzilla films, as we know, are timestamps of the culture and everything going on at the time. But
yeah,
I feel like this film especially kind of is that timestamp of everything: the economy, the culture, the movies that they enjoyed. It's very fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we should also mention that Omori, despite of what was all said at the time, he always said I'm not anti-American. I love foreign movies. I love American films. So he always disavowed the notion that this film was meant to be anti-American, even though again we had quotes before of him saying Japan's always being bashed by the Western world for being so wealthy and powerful. Let's show that in the movie. So so anyhow, so there you go.
We do have like 10 minutes, so I can edit in the clip and we can transition into that.
Okay.
Did you want to talk about some of this other later stuff?
Oh, are we on a time crunch?
I just have an hour from when we hit record, so I think we have like 10 to 15.
Oh, okay, sure. All right,
up to you.
Okay, well, just let me know if we need to wrap things up anytime soon. But anyhow, okay. So after Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Omori has decided I'm not going to stop being involved with Godzilla films, but I don't want to direct them at this point because they require so much time on me as the director to develop them and whatnot and work on them. It's basically a good two or so years of production on my part to get one of these films out. So at this point, I'd rather just be involved on the screenplay level. So Godzilla vs. Mothra, Godzilla vs. Destroya. He only writes the screenplays for those two films. And he's now able to focus his attention more on directing other kinds of pictures. So we have a film, The Reason I Got Sick, which is an anthology film of which he directed one part about, illnesses in Japan. There's a film called Succession, which is kind of a riff on the Yakuza culture in Japan in the 1990s. So again, this is a guy who was pretty productive as a director before Godzilla and remained productive after Godzilla as a director. So he wasn't like, Hashimoto or Okawara Yamashita, who just, stopped once he was done with the monster. He was still remaining productive in the intermediate years. Now, here's a film that he worked on in the 90s called Broken Heart. And here are three familiar faces for tokusatsu fans. We have Mizuno Miki, who was the heroine in Gamera 2. We have Tatsumi Takaru, who was the scientist in Godzilla vs. Destroya. And we have Saito Yosuke, who was the biologist turned international crime guy informant in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. Saito, by the way, was one of Omori's most frequent collaborators. He appeared in a large number of his movies, usually in a supporting role, but he was a common face in his films, going back to at least, as far as I know, Disciples of Hippocrates in 1980. So this movie is a story about various characters and their sort of romantic misadventures in an amusement park. So there we have comedies about illness, we have comedies about the Yakuza, we have comedies about romance and whatnot. So this is a guy who by no means was limited to just doing Godzilla films and Hollywood style entertainment. Case in point also with this very highly acclaimed film that came out the following year. Night Train to the Stars. It's a biopic about the famous poet and author Miyazawa Kenji. And this film is kind of noteworthy for featuring some sequences in which live action is mixed with animation. So the protagonist is writing his stories and poems about woodland animals, and his characters kind of appear in the film via animation to interact with him. This film was highly acclaimed. It won a Japanese Academy Prize, was nominated for 10 or 11 others, including Best Picture and Best Director. Probably one of his most widely acclaimed films of the 90s. And he also had some involvement with full-fledged animation. So this is a film called The Boy Who Saw the Wind. This film is probably one of his more readily accessible films outside of Japan. It's been subtitled. It's accessible pretty easily. It's based on a novel by C.W. Nicol, who was a Welshman who spent the majority of his life in Japan. Very good film, very fun, very cute. This one I would recommend to people. It's a good, solid film, and it's pretty accessible. And the final film we'll talk about, as far as his post-Godzilla film works go, well, one of his final works, post-Godzilla that we'll talk about, is this film, Try. This is a co-production between Japan, Korea, and China about gun smugglers in the early 20th century. And this actor here is Ken Watanabe. So Omori worked with Ken Watanabe, as well as a lot of other reputable people during the course of his career. One of his more action-centric films, very much Hong Kong-ish in its style. So, Omori was a guy who did all kinds of movies, all kinds of styles. And I think just by sampling, just these titles we've looked at, this was a guy who by no means made the same film on, again and again and again. He made all kinds of films in all different kinds of genres. He was a pretty active, productive filmmaker. Now, in his later years, Omori was pretty active at film festivals. In this photo here, we see him with the great French actress, Jeanne Moreau. As I mentioned before, Omori was a fan of the French New Wave, and one of his favorite movies was John Frankenheimer's film The Train from 1964, which co-stars Jeanne Moreau. So I'm sure he was every bit as delighted as he appears to be in the shot.
He looks real happy
of having met her. I'm sure it was a great honor for him. But yeah, he was active as a judge at film festivals. In 2006, he became head of the visual concept planning department at Osaka University of Arts, which is where he was employed until his passing. And at this point, he's more focused as an educator than a filmmaker. But at the same time, even though he's not associated with Godzilla anymore, he's not fully done with special effects, as we'll see next. So in 1999, Omori was attached to work on a film version of Komatsu Sakio's novel Japan Sinks, which was the basis for Submersion of Japan, Sinking of Japan, and various other adaptations. This film was never actually produced, but Shochiku did try to help get it off the ground. And here we see Omori with Komatsu trying to promote the film, get some development. Unfortunately, the film was never produced, but in spite of that, he was still involved with some special effects stuff. His fellow Godzilla alumni, Tezuka Masaki, who we know for directing Megaguiros and the Kiryu duology, made a live-action version of the anime called Rescue Wings. Omori was one of the screenwriters for that project. And most notably, he had some subsequent later year collaborations with Koichi Kawakita, who had directed the special effects for the Heisei Godzilla movies.
Please excuse the thunder and lightning outside if that picks up on my microphone, by the way, guys.
And so here's one of the projects that came along from their later partnership, Super Phaser X the movie, which features the Gotengo from Atragon. Omori counted as I said, Atragon as one of his childhood favorite special effects films. So appropriately enough, this film this mecha makes an appearance in this film that Kawakita and him worked on. Omori directed it. Kawakita did the special effects. And while Omori was at Osaka University of Arts, he at one point invited Kawakita to come along and help him teach some special effects courses. And a project that came along in this process, we'll see on the next screen. That was the project called Gunbot. I think it was a 4-episode project that was done using old-fashioned style special effects. If I recall correctly, it was the last thing that Kawakita had worked on before he passed away in 2014. So it would have also been their final collaboration between Omori and Kawakita. And but even after Kawakita passed away, Omori was still teaching special effects courses at Osaka University of Arts, in spite of the fact that CGI had come along and was very quickly replacing handcrafted special effects in Japan as elsewhere. And in spite of that, he was always delighted to know that his students still had interest in old-fashioned handcrafted special effects, and he was grateful to keep teaching that to the next generation. So, and that I think is a big part of Omori's legacy, is that in spite of the fact that he outgrew Godzilla as a young man, and in spite of the fact that he admitted hey, I'm not really big into Godzilla as an adult, he still brought a lot of energy to these films, a lot of fresh ideas. He was dedicated. He brought a lot of dedication to what he was doing, and he still continued the tradition of old-fashioned Japanese special effects through teaching them to the next generation to his students. So that I think is one of his a big part of his legacy in the kaiju tokusatsu realm, is that he was active in this stuff even after his time with Godzilla was done. And I think we can, as fans, we can definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, 100%. And even just as like a filmmaker, the fact that he went on to just teach film, I believe that's what he taught. You can correct me there.
Filmmaking, film production,
just like cool. Just stuff like that. I mean, even then, his legacy at the end was just passing the torch on to the next generation. And I think that's the greatest thing a filmmaker could do, personally.
Mm-hmm.
As we wrap things up, Patrick, first off, I want to thank you for doing this on a public note. I super appreciate you being on here with your expertise in Japanese cinema and just film at large, to eulogize a director that you've also personally spoken to, which is incredible. I would ask you, again, you've kind of answered this already, but what would be the lasting impressions on Omori for his life and his just career and life in general?
Well, I hope what people take away from this whole presentation is that Omori was not some kind of studio hack who was just brought in just to make product for the company. This was a guy who made his mark on the Japanese film world before Godzilla came along, was sought out for it. And this is a guy who brought a lot of fresh ideas, sometimes to controversial effect, as with Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, but who still he definitely shook things up, definitely left his mark on the genre. And we still see a lot of like his influence, in Godzilla today with these a lot of these like the tone of his films. You could argue has influenced subsequent films. The crazy mechs and whatnot. The technology, fighting monsters with technology, and so on and so forth, has remained a thing. This is a guy who brought a lot of style and energy to these films. And Godzilla versus Biollante. Polls are always silly. Don't really necessarily not always a metric for anything, but wherever you think of them, at the same time, it's worth noting, Biollante, for a film that didn't do so well when it first came out, at one point it was chosen by a poll as, the fans, favorite Godzilla film, and it's regularly made appearances in, polls in Japan as being amongst people's favorites. And, again, that's not a proven metric of any kind, but, I think it's fair to say his films that he worked on are also quite popular here in the United States as well. You definitely I've talked to a number of people who, like Godzilla versus Biollante and King Ghidorah an awful lot. And there's a lot of people who enjoy Godzilla versus Destroyer, which he wrote the screenplay for. So, but also, again, I hope the major takeaway is this is a guy who was active as a director before Godzilla and was active as a director long time after his mark with the monster was done. So his time with the monster was done. So I think that's ultimately his legacy. Of all the Heisei directors, he's the only guy you can say that about. So,
and I especially I apologize, I just totally cut you off. What were you gonna say?
No, that's fine, go ahead.
What I was gonna say is I think it's important to do what you guys do at Kaiju Masterclass and kind of what we do as well. I mean, a lot of these Godzilla directors, they do have lives and careers outside of big monster, and I think it's important to highlight that. I really think that a lot of people should learn more about these guys, and I hope that people have learned through this wonderful presentation by Patrick.
Yep, and as mentioned, the interview with Kazuki Omori that's done for Kaiju Masterclass, that can be found on our YouTube channel, 100% free to watch. He was very jovial, very kind, very forthcoming, very funny, very forthcoming with his answers, spoke with a genuine passion and love for his craft and for his career as an educator. Very, very nice guy. It was great that we had the chance to talk to him and challenge him with some real questions about his career and his contribution to this franchise that we all know and love. So it was an honor to have him, and I hope that people will walk away from this presentation with a little more understanding of who he was and what he was all about.
Sweet. Thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us tonight. Hopefully we will have you on again sometime soon.
No, thank you for having me. It was an honor.